Firstly, an apology. I was quite pleased when Z published the book because it's got a lovely stable of progressive books and it's owned by a workers' cooperative. But what I did think of was that when it's published in the UK, it'll charge in UK pounds, which would mean that it's expensive in South Africa. So it costs something like £61. If you order it online, which you can, it came out middle of last month. It comes to about 1,050 rand. If you order it through Van Schuyks, they charge about 1,700 rand. So it's kind of exorbitantly expensive. That's why we're only raffling one copy. But what UKZN Press is currently talking to Z Books about a joint publication arrangement to bring the price down in South Africa. We're also going to have 2 copies in the Rhodes Library, so people can read it there. Rhodes Library's already ordered one. I'll donate one. We'll have another copy in the Nolse Resource Centre, and there'll be a copy at ECSEC, Eastern Cape Socio-Economic Consultative Council. I'll see how widely I can, because I get about 5 copies, so I'll donate some around. So firstly that's the apology. Now, just obviously it's quite a thing to try and talk about the contents of a book, particularly one that deals with processes complicated. So I'm going to try and do the best I can. I hope I give you enough to want to read the book, despite its price. So the genesis of the book, this book came from my own immersion in the Provincial Growth and Development Planning process in the Eastern Cape. I was part of this process as a member of the Project Management Unit that was funded by the United Nations Development Programme. We also had funding from the I'm going about another slide. We also had funding from DFID of the UK, and that money was used mainly for specialist studies, to pay people to do various specialist studies. So in about 2002, I joined the Project Management Unit, or PMU, first to provide what's called content support. That was to support the person who was writing what was known as a baseline and constraints report that kind of set the scene. Then I worked on various drafts of the strategy framework, and then later on assumed the role of monitoring and evaluation specialist, and did some work on initial design of a monitoring and evaluation system to support the PGDP. And then I left, and later on I was brought back to assist with the packaging of programs, and then right at the end, final editing of the documents against insane deadlines. This is the plan itself that was launched in 2004. Throughout my work on this plan and afterwards, I had deep concerns about processes, about choices that were made, and about outcomes. The PGDP was formally sort of reviewed in about 2007, 2008 in a process led by ECSEC, the Eastern Cape Socio-Economic Consultative Council. And when you read the book, you'll see ECSEC played a very key role in the whole process. And I'll say a bit more about that. Now, in this 2007 review, a number of things were found about the impact of this plan. Now, one of the things about this plan, it had what was called a quantified vision. Hi. Welcome. I will sort of read through it briefly. The point is not so much the specifics of it, but just to give you a sense that there was a real attempt to transform the political economy of the province. And if I talk about political economy, we've got to look at their strategic objectives, which spoke about various types of transformation at the level of institutions in terms of the economy, society, and then we had these quantified, this quantified vision, these targets, broad targets. So first one is to maintain an economic growth rate of between 5% and 8% per annum. The minimum required to start creating jobs, because we'd had a period of jobless growth. To halve the unemployment rate by 2014. This, in fact, was a target set at the Job Summit in 2003 that was incorporated. To reduce by between 60 and 80% the number of households living below the poverty line by 2014. So quite ambitious targets. to reduce by between 60 and 80% the proportion of people suffering from hunger by 2014, to establish food self-sufficiency in the province by 2014, to ensure universal primary education by 2014, with all children proceeding to the first exit point in a secondary education. We're still failing on education. To improve the literacy rate in the province by 50% by 2014. To eliminate gender disparity in education and employment by 2014. To reduce by 2/3 the under 5 mortality rate by 2014. To reduce by 3/4 the maternal mortality rate by 2014. To halt and begin to reverse the spread of HIV/AIDS by 2014. Now, this was a controversial one. This is at the time when Mbeki was president and AIDS denialism was at its height. To halt and begin to reverse the spread of tuberculosis by 2014. To provide clean water to all in the province by 2014, and to eliminate sanitation problems by 2014. Some of those targets you'll recognize as very close to the Millennium Development Goals, and those were mainstreamed into these. Obviously, with the United Nations Development Program involved, that would be one of the things they would have looked at. Now, when this review was done, one of the things that the review team looked at is how we've done against those targets. So, just a few of those. I'll sit here. For example, in 2007, when this was done, the expanded rate of unemployment in the Eastern Cape stood at 53%. I always prefer to use the expanded definition, of course, because it includes people who are not actively looking for work, and there are various reasons why we do that. More than 2/3 of the total Eastern Cape population fell below the poverty line. In 2007, health indicators pointed to persisting, even worsening health outcomes. So things got worse. Education, we know, is still a problem. Then when I looked at 2011, look at this, the last census we had was in 2011. So this was after that review. We've still had a very high percentage, 64% of the population of working age living below the poverty line. Our expanded employment rate stood at 47% in 2011 in the province, rising to the high 50s in district municipal areas that contained large portions of the former Bantustans of Transkei and Ciskei. So looking at the outcomes, and particularly the sort of impacts on in terms of these indicators, my worries were intensified. And it's not just the fact that this plan did not succeed in achieving its objective, it's the almost catastrophic nature of its failure. And this is given in spite of the fact that we had a former liberation movement in government in alliance with the SACP and COSATU. We had wide buy-in in this process from organised labour, from organised civil society, from chambers of business. People formally participated and gave written and verbal support. So why did we fail like this? And the review that was run in 2007, they identified 4 reasons. One was national policy fragmentation, particularly in terms of the long-term development strategy. They also said there was a lack of funding and technical resources that had retarded progress. Third, they said public sector implementation capacity had not been sufficient. And fourthly, they said the PGDP had not been championed effectively by the political leadership of the province. One could say that, there's some truth to all of that, but for me it was even deeper than that. And my thinking about this led me to ask questions about state power and state policy. And I realized I had to understand this better to understand what had happened in this process. In a nutshell, this book traces the opening and closure of the possibility of a fundamental policy challenge at an important conjuncture in our history. For example, this was a time when the governing tripartite alliance came very close to splitting. So this process started in about 2002. In about 2001, 2006, starting from about 2000, COSATU started mobilizing very strongly against jobless growth, against privatization of state resources, very much against GEAR and the whole set of policies associated with that. In about 2002, in the SACP, I think it's 11th conference, cabinet ministers and members that supported GEAR were voted off the central committee. Mbeki started talking about ultra-leftists within the ANC. In the run-up to the ANC's 51st conference in December 2002, a challenge from the Eastern Cape, which was sort of really the base of much of this challenge, was effectively neutralized. I think a third of the delegates were disqualified, and Mbeki won quite a big victory there. Subsequently, Stofile, who was the premier of the province at the time, even though he was voted in as provincial chair again, that provincial conference was ruled invalid. Another one was held. He was voted in yet again with Godongwana as his deputy. He was still removed as premier by Mbeki, and Nosibo Balendlela was installed. So it's a time of reckoning, major shifts, much fracturing. COSATU itself, in reflecting on that time, pointed to how close the alliance came to splitting. It was also a time when social movements were at their most visible. In about 2001, there was that World Conference Against Racism, and the next year it was the World Summit on Sustainable Development, and social movements became very, very prominent and mobilized around those big events. And of course, COSATU also started interacting with these social movements. And also related to all of this was the effects of South Africa's macroeconomic policy were becoming increasingly clear, particularly, of course, in this province. There's no surprise that in many ways this province has been the home of the left and a home of challenge. We still see the effects of apartheid spatial economy very clearly here with the former Transkei and Ciskei. We're still dealing with very high unemployment, inequality, etc. And what the book then also shows is how this moment was very consciously seized, perhaps naively in some ways, to challenge hegemony, but this challenge unraveled in very complex ways, and that's what I'm trying to show. Now, there's some useful ideas that I draw on. The first one is thinking of the state as a social relation. This is an idea that comes particularly from Nikos Polantzas. Now, obviously, the state, you can identify, sort of buildings, you can identify arms of the state, you can identify, there's a government with people, there's parliament, etc. You can identify the security apparatus of the state. But fundamentally, what underlies all of that is the idea that the state is a social relation. For Polantzas, the state was the condensation of social relations within the social formation in which the state was found. Linked to this is the idea that the state is the primary domain for the organization of power. Now, the word primary is important. It's not the only, it's the primary domain. There are other domains at varying degrees of distance from the state. And one thing Jessup points out is that this kind of puts the state in a very difficult position, because on the one hand it's an institutional ensemble that's part of the social formation, but at the same time it's particularly charged with maintaining coherence of that social formation, particularly in a national territory. And it's doomed to always fail because it is not the only domain on which power is organized. And obviously, the boundaries between, say, the state and civil society, or between sites of power within the state and the distance to the state, shift as well. So, for example, if social movements gain ascendancy, if protests reach a certain level of ferment, those kind of centers of powers then retain a higher kind of a level of effectiveness. Now, agency is exercised on a strategically selective terrain. This is very much what Jessup talks about. What this means is that it moves away from a very structural idea of the state and how state power is organized. Agency is important. Individuals can make a difference, either on their own or most effectively in organized groupings. But they're not guaranteed success. They're not guaranteed that what they plan will happen. Because, for example, someone like Paul Pearson, who took on rational choice theory that was often used in trying to understand policy, pointed out that policy choices that are made happen in time, and they happen in relation to previous decisions and resource allocations that have happened. So you might make calculations as to what the degree of risk of failure or success is if you decide to do X, Y, and Z, either as an individual sitting as an official somewhere or a policy advisor, or as a grouping trying to influence change. Sometimes what seems to be the effect of individual action or particular group action is actually more related to something that happened in the past or in the wider society. For example, if the country has embarked on an economic development strategy, say for example GEAR, and choices are made around monetary and fiscal policy, in terms of that constrains the space for future decisions and agency in relation to the economy. So that's just a more obvious example. Another one is, for example, if you make plans within government, you have to then, those plans for them to be action have to enter into resource allocations. Those resource allocations are done in terms of principles, procedures and policies that were developed previously. Those fundamentally constrain how you implement whatever you've decided. So you have agency, but the agency is operates on the strategically selective terrain. It bumps against other agents, it bumps against procedures, it bumps against previous resource allocations. But it doesn't mean agency can't happen. State power can be organized in the form of ruling blocks through which hegemony is exercised. So it's not a completely chaotic free-for-all. You can actually try and create some coherence, but it's always an achievement, and it's always open to challenge. Now, in many ways, what you can think of the state as is a field of power with various nodes at which power is exercised. Now, those nodes can be situated in various branches, various state apparatuses, or various branches of those apparatuses. For example, in particular government departments, or within the legislative arm vis-a-vis the executive, or in a province vis-a-vis the national government, or in terms of the process of decision making. You have the classic thing where people talk about the tail wagging the dog, when procurement people push government people to make decisions purely based on a very often a conservative view of what should be done, which in many ways we probably one conservative given the kind of looting of resources that have happened. But people so even within a department or within a sphere of government, there are people sitting in a provincial treasury, for example, or a national treasury, who can have major effects on how implementation happens, even how policy is formulated, just by virtue of their positioning. So they exercise power. There's a possibility of power being exercised. How and when it's exercised is not given. It's not pre-given. It depends on who sits there, how they organize. So sometimes people can organize in the forms of these ruling blocks. Policy is the discursive expression of the organization of state power. Now, obviously you can look at various policies and see what sort of class effects, if you will, they have. Are they to the benefit of workers or not, etc. But you can't go back from that policy and then make assumptions or understand how those were arrived at and say it's because these and these people worked together in this way. Often when people try and talk about how power is organized, they talk in terms of power blocks, and they make sort of assumptions about how various classes or class fractions form alliances, etc. But those things always have to be inferred, and they often assume arrangements that would require far more organizational capacity than is really logically possible. Especially when people border on inferring conspiracies, whether it's white monopoly capital in some sort of alliance with X, Y, Z. It's actually not as simple as that. You don't need these explanations to understand how certain outcomes are reproduced, how the logic of capitalism is reproduced, which it is. And the state we're looking at is a capitalist state form. So we need to understand the subtlety of how this happens in order to understand how one can work against it. In the realm of discourse, policy interacts with conceptions of what is right, what is possible, what exists, and what is possible. This is a kind of, which is what ideology is about. This is Thurborn who defined ideology in terms of what is right, what exists, and what is possible. So ideology here is not just seen as something that masks reality, that hides what is really going on. Ideology is what makes it possible for us to think. What makes it possible for us to be hailed as subjects, to be interpolated. It incorporates its most formal form as formal theory. So, for example, economic theory is the most formal form that the ideological conceptions of how the economy should be organized is expressed. Intellectual specialists are specialists in discursive practice, and foremost amongst those are economists, particularly when one talks about state policy. And of course, what happens with intellectual specialists is they are given power through institutions by having qualifications conferred on them, being located in certain departments, being given certain positions. That gives their voice, their input, more authority than, say, someone speaking from a different perspective. So the intellectuals are positioned within society, within institutions and social relations, and by virtue of their position can have greater or lesser influence. So those are just some of the ideas. So what was the PGDP? And some of this will become clearer when I actually go through this as in the time that remains. The PGDP was a 10-year growth and development plan for the Eastern Cape Province, covering the period 2004 to 2014. It followed a very strongly participatory process funded by the UNDP and DFID. The process itself was designed by the UNDP in consultation with actors in the province, and then was unfolded. And I'll show you a bit more about that just now. It contained a strategy framework which had that quantified vision I spoke about, had 6 strategic objectives, and also had some description of how we came to this conclusion. At a number of programs that were defined in relation to those strategic objectives. They had more specific program components, responsibilities of various organizations, and broad budget allocations. And there was also a monitoring evaluation framework, there was a spatial framework, there was a description of institutional arrangements for coordination of planning. So for example, as a result of this, a new Deputy Director General post was created in the Office of the Premier responsible for planning coordination, and was resourced, just as one example, including monitoring and evaluation, etc. And this was supported by a dedicated project management unit, which I was part of. And it was managed by the provincial government. So it fell directly, and I'll show you now in a picture how this worked. So all of this fell under EXCO, the Executive Council, or the Provincial Cabinet. It's another way of describing them. And everything that EXCO looked at was funneled through the Economic Growth and Development Cabinet Committee. So let's start at the bottom. There were a number of specific workshops, sort of ad hoc workshops, that were held with municipalities maybe, or with COSATU, or whoever that would lift out issues. There were various specialist studies that were undertaken. These were always, that's the thing, these were always undertaken under the direction of these. So they were never just done independently. So these were the key engines of this process, the 4 working groups. One focused on economic growth and development, one on fiscal matters, one on social needs, one on governance. All of them had participation from all the sort of social partners. So there were government officials, politicians, members of organised labour, organised business, and then various specialists were invited also to give input. These working groups in their discussions would often decide, we don't know enough about X, Y, and Z, can we please have a study? It was our job as a PMU to then make those studies happen, in particular my job. So I commissioned all the specialist studies that happened, particularly during the strategy framework process. And then when these studies were done, they had to be presented to the working group who engaged and then factored that into its decisions. All these working groups were represented in a reference group that also included representation from the UNDP and DFID, senior government officials. And initially the idea was that the MECs would be part of this, but they increasingly separated themselves here, so that what was decided here had to be filtered and then they could make decisions independently of this. So in some ways asserting more control over this process than was the initial conception in relation to the other social partners. This is more about the project management unit here. So how it was organized was the Director General was of the province was had overall responsibility for the operational side of the process. Together with the Executive Director of EXEC, the Eastern Cape Socio-Economic Consultative Council, they formed what was known as the PGTP Management Group, sometimes called Working Group Zero. This person, as you'll see in the book, was not very present until a particular time in the process. The PGDP project director was seconded from EXEC. So EXEC had quite a strong influence in terms through its executive director on the management group and its secondment of the PGDP project director. This person was Lita Mabeni. Director General then was Mvuyu Tom. Now initially I worked sort of over here as content support. So the project director and I worked on the initial inputs, and we bounced between the two of us reports to the EXCO and its cabinet committee. Later on, once the strategy framework had been developed, I took on this role here. Project manager was appointed, a development economist was appointed quite late, and given the high rate at which this person was appointed, could only be appointed half-time, which huge implications for coordination, etc. And there was a communications person, and then various administrative officials. Now, this is the process timeline. Now, this appears in the book as well, and the whole idea is sort of an anchor for the discussion throughout, because the book goes in great detail, looks at how these processes unfolded. It looks, for example, at the specialist studies, what they were about, how the various inputs were taken up in discussions within the working groups, what appeared within the various editions. There were 8 versions of the strategy framework, for example, how those changed over time, what decisions were made in various forums in relation to those changes, who pushed for what, and eventually how we ended up with the strategy framework that was launched here on the 26th of June 2003 by Makinkesi Stofile, the Premier then. How that strategy framework was then taken into a program development phase, leading up to the launch of the full PGP in 2004 by Nosimo Balindlela. She was appointed just after the 2004 elections, which the ANC won. And in fact, it was a night of long knives. Stofile and Godongwana, etc., were all quite triumphant after their 2003 re-election, and it was completely unexpected that she would take over. Mbeki just announced this. She promptly took care of Godongwana, went after Jonas, Mkhabisi Jonas, and Stofile was redeployed as the National Minister of Sport. Godongwana, of course, currently is the Economic Policy Supremo in the ANC. Jonas, we know, eventually became MEC for Finance and Economic Development in the province, then Deputy National Minister of Finance, and is now an envoy of the new president. So these are all people that played a role. For example, Jonas is the one who facilitated here. We had an EXCO workshop. At one point, you'll see in the book, EXCO was unhappy with what we presented because it was too much of a challenge to what the ANC was comfortable with. So they wanted a workshop with us, and Jonas was asked to facilitate that. Now, just in relation to... I can't go into the detail of how all these processes work. And I think the value of an account of this is it takes you into detail that only an insider can give you. There are also methodological challenges to being an insider, which I also speak to. I can't really go into that. If there are questions about that, we can talk about it. So I just want to put this timeline in relation to some of the wider processes, some of which I've already mentioned. For example, the splits in the alliance, the social movements that emerged, etc. So obviously here in 2002, we already spoke to the point of how things had developed within the alliance. And so when this process was launched, and the province had not been sort of, the provincial ruling bloc had not been ousted at that point yet. So there was still a challenge, a nascent sort of challenge, political challenge within the province that still remained, organized around the person of Stofile. And Godongwana and Jonas were very strongly in alliance with him. Godongwana and Stofile spoke very strongly in Parliament and in the provincial legislature against, for example, age denialism by Mbeki. They took him on that. They also spoke about, paid lip service in many ways to a different approach to economic development. But here the contradictions within different people become clear. You'll see it very clearly in the book. Godongwana was very strongly in support of the IDZs, which in many ways are another kind of form of a strategic selectivity locking us into a certain development trajectory. The very first IDZ in the country, Industrial Development Zone, was established in this province, the Kucha IDZ, followed by the East London IDZ. So these were piloted here. Already in this time, massive amounts of money were being pumped in by the national government, billions into Kucha, with nothing to show. And dwarfing completely, and the provincial government also put some money into it through the Eastern Cape Development Corporation, dwarfing what was put into, for example, agrarian transformation, showing very clearly where the national government economic priorities were, despite the rhetoric. It was an export-focused economic development. It was not on building effective demand, building the local economy, building agriculture, looking at agrarian transformation, for example, secondary industrialization on the basis of primary production. So you can already see there's some interesting dynamics emerging with even within the provincial political establishments. On the one level, they were seen as a ruling bloc standing, sort of almost in opposition or competition with the national ruling bloc, just for sake of convenience, named as the Mbeki sort of bloc. But they themselves were fractured, and they were in alliance with the alliance partners in the province, which were particularly strongly mobilizing for a new take, challenging gear, etc. Now, at this time, many of the challenges that were launched by the left, including, for example, arguing for the basic income grant, had already been neutralized. I think it's around in 2002 that the ANC, NEC formally rejected BIG. We still kept BIG alive in these initial discussions. Even though gear, etc., was reaffirmed, many of these discussions, these were safe spaces working groups, people still were very critically engaged with how we could change that. Other things, I'm really running out of time, so I'm just thinking of how to do this. So we've spoken about, trying to think of other important processes or policy developments that were important. Also to note here, before 2002, in about 2000, we had the first local government elections under the new dispensation of new demarcations, new structures, new powers and functions. So we had a situation where this planning process happened within a relatively new administration since 1994. The provincial government administrations had to be fashioned out of the remnants of the old. So old Transkei administration, the old Ciskei, and bits of the old Cape Provincial administration. So they were not that old from 94 onwards to this time. And of course, what these systems bring with them are also various remnants, old tribute networks, old ways of practice, etc. And to fashion a new administration out of those bits and pieces is no easy task. Also, the province is a huge area, so there were logistical difficulties as well, and hard to deal with the administrative challenges, resource allocations, etc. Local government, which was expected to increasingly take on an active role in development planning, was very new, 2000. There were active pushes within this process to decentralize to the local government level. Not the implementation, but in many ways re-centralizing power, political power upwards. In many ways, making local governments a site of just managing dissent, rather than actively developing the areas for which they were responsible. Another important thing to notice, in 2004 we had national elections. So this process of program development increasingly found itself running against this deadline, which meant there was increasing pressure, political pressure, for quick deliverables. Sort of programs that could be showcased. And of course, what do you do when you face those pressures? You repackage what's already there. So in many cases, what happened, those early programs were just repackaging of existing programs. Now, another thing to note is that, and of course, there are all sorts of other things that happened. 2004 was the launch of the, I'm trying to get my dates right, I put them down here. NSDP, another important thing, National Spatial Development Perspective, 2003, it was launched. Now, what happened is the backdrop for all of this, what we attempted, what we spoke about here in this process, is a need for coordinated economic development planning, something at the national government level which was actively shunned. COSATU and the SACP had been calling for this, the ANC had rejected this. They were particularly wary of active industrial policy. But again, it was not a unified government position. People in the Department of Trade and Industry, DTI, were actively mobilizing for active industrial policy. So there was, again, power being exercised at various nodes within the state apparatuses. People were trying to push and having some successes, some setbacks. And so you have pushes from within and without in various directions. These interface with each other. In the end, you have an outcome that reflects these power dynamics. It's not an outcome that's neatly calibrated to somehow be true to those. It's an active reflection of what happens in engagement and interaction. So, we actively explored the need and spoke about the need for more integrated planning. And in fact, 2005, the province started its own Provincial Industrial Development Strategy, or PIDS, which was abandoned because it was overtaken in 2006 by Asgisa. Asgisa later on was overtaken by the National Industrial Policy Framework, 2007. Under that, there were these IPAPs, Integrated Industrial Policy Action Plans, IPAPs. Then the New Growth Path came out about 2010, very strongly supported by the alliance partners, COSATU and the SACP, but very quickly overtaken by the National Development Plan, which was rejected. So already in 2010, you had the Green Paper for the National Planning Commission. 2011, you had the launch of the Diagnostic Report, and you had the launch of the full National Development Plan, which went against a number of things that were put in the New Growth Path. So you can see in many ways here some attempts to approach even planning in a different way that had to interface with processes within the larger society that were then also then affected in turn by by what happened. For example, we started a provincial industrial development strategy linked to this. It was overtaken. And in fact, later picked up again in 2010, and with an attempt to go back to the ideas of the new growth partner, a very active challenge to macroeconomic policy. But again, that was neutralized, because by that stage, the ruling bloc had completely been neutralized in the province. So, and another thing just to mention before I end is this I just made brief reference to 2003, the National Spatial Development Perspective. I think this is an important indication of how national government tried to exert influence over the province at the level of planning instruments. Even after effectively a new ruling bloc had taken control of the province. Now the NSDP in many ways reaffirmed the old spatial layout of the country. So it identified the Bantustans as having been effectively labour reserves and continuing to do so. And what government had to do in development is secure just the most basic needs there. Water, sanitation, most basic social needs. But actively encourage migration to the urban centres, which were the centres for economic development. And of course in the province the two major centres were East London and Port Elizabeth, and traditionally centres of manufacturing with very strong focus on the automotive sector. So that was the focus. When 2004 there was a rollout of this National Spatial Development Perspective, and people came to the province and tried to sell this. We're going very much contrary to what the PGDP had already decided on in terms of developing the former Bantustans, for example, supporting agrarian transformation, looking at land reform, etc., building secondary industries that took primary production further, added value, etc. This international intervention was widely rejected in the province. I remember in one of the interactions, Erwin Jim, who was then deputy provincial chairperson for COSATU, had his veins bulging in his neck, shouting at this professor of the University of the Free State. He was called Agent Orange by people in the province, saying, how can you just... Because the person said, this is how it works, you should just do it like that, this is logical, but we've just been through a process. This demonstrated the buy-in that had been obtained from people in the province. The provincial chair of COSATU could say, this is our PGDP, what you're saying goes against it, and we will not accept it. What happened in 2005, the presidency went even further. It developed provincial growth and development strategy guidelines, which it wanted to impose across the country 2 years after the province had launched the PGDP. And one of the things that said in those guidelines is that PGDSs had to conform to the National Spatial Development Perspective. At that stage, the Provincial Director General was Sibongile Mutwa, who's currently the Vice Chancellor of Nelson Mandela University, and she wrote a very strongly worded but polite letter saying, go to hell, we're not going to do it, this is our plan. Eventually the NSDP was updated 2006 and eventually not included in the early drafts of the National Development Plan, and then roundly rejected, actively critiqued in the final version of the NDP. So there again is a policy trajectory that was attempt was made to utilise to discipline the province. It failed. That itself was overtaken by other developments. Again, just an illustration of how you have these complex processes. I think sometimes what one must also think of, if you think of how you have all these different systems that interface with each other in very complex ways. What this book tries to do is to do it dynamically. And hopefully it's interesting for you if you read it. But you can also think of these things almost... One way in which Jessup described it is you can think of nested systems where some attain ecological dominance over others. So economic systems can attain ecological dominance over other systems. It doesn't neutralize those systems. There's other domains in which power is exercised, but it has a certain ecological dominance. So, for example, if macroeconomic decisions are made, if you only allow certain kinds of fiscal and monetary decision-making, if you lock yourself into international agreements around trade, etc., you set a framework within which other systems have to operate. I don't know if that made any sense. It was a lot of material. There we go. I've got to end there. Thanks.